Just talk in a normal voice.
This is a test of my memory, a test of my voice, a test of the effectiveness of antihistamine head clearer.
Okay, hang on. Okay, so it is April 2017, and so Dad, tell me your name and when and where you were born.
The name is James Weintraub, often called Jim, or Jamesy by my mother. Born in Berlin, Germany, June 25th, 1938.
Okay, tell me your grandparents' names and where they were born.
I'm a little fuzzy on my father's parents, but my grandparents' names were Moses Cohen and Helen Cohen. They were both born in Poland and lived most of their lives in Germany. My father's parents, to the extent I know, were born in an area that may have been Poland, may have been Lithuania, may have been the Ukraine, but somewhere in Eastern Europe. That's all I know.
Okay, and when did Grandpa, and tell me Grandpa's name and Grandma's names, just for the video.
My parents' name was Jacob Herman Weintraub and Irmgard Weintraub. And my mother was born in Brombauer, Germany. It's a small town close to the Dutch border in western Germany. And my father was born in somewhere in Poland or Lithuania, I'm not sure, but also spent the vast majority of his life in Germany before he immigrated to the United States.
Okay, and what happened to your grandparents when it became clear that Berlin was not a place to live?
Once again, I'm fuzzy on the details of my father's parents. My mother's parents refused to emigrate to the United States when they had an opportunity to do so. And I can get into that more about that later when we get further on into the story. My father's parents stayed behind in Eastern Europe. My grandfather, on my father's side, died in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
What was his name?
His name was Leib Weintraub, L-E-I-B, Weintraub. And my grandmother, who I never knew, and never knew specifically what happened to her, disappeared during the wartime period.
Okay. And what happened to the Cohens during the war?
The Cohens, my maternal grandparents, my maternal grandparents stayed behind in Germany, and how they arrived at that decision I don't know. But shortly after the war began, a group of Israelis or Palestinians at the time came to Germany and assembled a group of, I think, 400 Jews from Germany, literally walked them across Germany while the war was going on to a place in Italy where they took a tramp steamer which they had rented with the intention of going to Palestine. At the time it was called Palestine. When they got to Palestine, the British would not allow them to land, refueled the boat, gave them additional food, and the boat spent the next 3 years wandering around the Mediterranean Sea, going from one port to another while World War II was going on around them. Sometime in the middle of 1944, after 3 years on the boat sank in the Aegean Sea. They were picked up by a British destroyer. They were brought to an Italian prisoner of war camp called Ferramonte, where they were kept for I don't know how many months, at a time when the Allies had already recaptured that part of Italy. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Ruth Gruber and her assistants and her helpers were trying to get approval for the American government to allow German refugees into the United States while the war was going on. Eventually, they approved the entrance of 1,000 Jews, mostly Jews, of which the Faramonte group comprised 400 or 500 of the half of the group, and they were brought to the United States in, I believe, it was September of 1944, which is one of my earliest memories. They were put in a U.S. Army military base in Oswego, New York, on the shores of Lake Ontario, I believe, if I remember correctly, where they moved into the barracks, which were vacated by American soldiers that had gone overseas. And one of my earliest memories, and they were kept in that camp for a month in isolation until they weeded out the typhus cases and the typhoid cases and so forth. At the end of a month, my mother and I got on a train and we went from New York or Brooklyn, where we lived, up to Oswego to visit with them. And one of my earliest memories is being on a troop train going north and passing me up and down the aisle to go to the bathroom, because the train was so overcrowded with people that everyone was sitting on the floor from one end to the other. Unfortunately, the articles describing the reunification of my mother with her parents or my grandparents didn't survive the move of my parents from New York to Florida. But they were interviewed by the paper where my mother was reunited with her parents after an interval of 6 years of separation due to the war.
Were they in contact with each other during the 6 years?
There were no contact.
So she didn't know, she had no idea if they were alive or dead during that time?
I was only 6 years old at the time, so I don't remember whether she had any word. I assume she knew nothing about them until they were perhaps selected to join the group that went to Oswego, New York. Just as a sidelight, a couple of years ago we saw a documentary about the Jews of Oswego, and of course the barracks no longer exists, and the only thing that marks the presence of these Jews in the story, that they lived behind barbed wire. Most of them were there for 2 or 3 years before they were allowed to emigrate, because the only reason they were allowed into Oswego was on the condition that they returned to Europe after the war was over. Fortunately, they had contacts and influence with the American government, and one by one, the people were let out from behind the barbed wire in Oswego, and eventually most of them stayed and didn't go back to Europe. After a separation of 6 or 7 years, my grandparents and my mother lived within a block of each other in Brooklyn, together with my mother's brother, which is another story of how they survived the war. If you'd like me to tell that, I can too.
Tell me, I'd like you to tell me the story about how Grandpa got out of Germany. So what Grandpa did when he was there, and then how he got out and left Grandma pregnant with you.
Eventually, my maternal grandmother and grandfather and father moved from their respective places where they were born and grew up, moved to Berlin. So the whole family lived in Berlin. And the citizenship requirements in Germany were much more strict than they are here in the United States. And they were never granted German citizenship, even though they had lived all of their lives, save the first year or two, they had lived in Germany. So my father had a friend in the American embassy after the war broke out, and America was not yet involved in it, but the war was ongoing, saying that Hitler was going to exile or throw out any Polish Jews that had not acquired German citizenship, and that it was going to happen within a few weeks. And after, I guess, some harried meetings of the family, we decided my father would attempt to leave Germany, which he did, and he left my mother, who was pregnant at the time with me. He left my mother, my pregnant mother, with his parents, who also lived in Berlin at the time. So when my father came to the United States, my mother was staying with her in-laws in Berlin. And a year later, in April of 1939, I believe, my mother and I came to the United States, where my father had been there almost a year already. So that's how my father came to the United States. Did he leave anything out?
No.
Oh.
But when, tell me about his time, what you know about his time here before you and Grandma came.
Well, my father had worked in Germany for my uncle, for my mother's uncle as a furrier. That's where he learned the trade from my mother's uncle.
Mm-hmm.
And when he came to the United States, he was very skilled at what he did, and he had a job as second he got off the boat, and went into the fur market, and in very short order was in his own business, and he was saving up to welcome my mother to the United States, and eventually brought. And he tells stories of, he didn't have breakfast so he could go see a Robin Hood movie as a treat while he was trying to save money. So by the time my mother got here, which was about a year after he got here, he already had an apartment furnished in Brooklyn, in the Borough Park, Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. It was a three-room apartment. Let's say we had a living room, dining room. No, we didn't have a dining room. We had a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. And I don't even remember. I slept in the same room with my parents. That's right. I slept in the same room with my parents. My mother, my grandchildren, I should say, my children will always tease me about coming across to Ellis Island as an immigrant. My mother always liked to say she was not an immigrant. She came to the United States with her silver and her china. Because at that time it was the policy of the German government not to kill the Jews, but to get them out as quickly as possible, to rid Germany of Jews. So not well known is the fact that 2/3 of the German Jews survived the war because they were urged to emigrate. They were encouraged to emigrate, either though they'd leave all their possessions in Europe at the time.
Okay.
My mother had two brothers, an older brother and a younger brother. The older brother, during the Hitler time, was old enough to go off on his own, and he went to Palestine before the war broke out, and ended up as a soldier in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army fighting against the Nazis in North Africa. Her younger brother was a teenager, was about 14 when the war broke out, and he was evacuated to England with the kinder transport, where generous English people act as surrogate parents for Jewish children that were sent out of Europe to be more safe, send a safer environment outside of Europe. And he spent the entire war growing up and maturing and marrying in England. And within a year after the war was over, my mother, my father, my grandparents, Moses and Helen, my Uncle Kurt and his wife Erna, my Uncle Henry and his wife Lillian, all lived on the same block in Brooklyn, which is kind of miraculous in and of itself.
Okay. Tell me about your paternal grandparents.
As I mentioned before, the only thing I knew about my paternal grandmother was she disappeared from somewhere in Poland. She lost contact with the family in early 1942, which is the last letter that anybody had from her, and nobody knows how she ended, but she never surfaced again. My paternal grandfather was killed in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Perhaps 25 or 30 years ago, my father received a letter from his cousin in England, who said that he had been to Germany and had identified the graves of his father and my father's father, Leib, my grandfather, and had cleaned up the tombstone and paid for perpetual care. And years later, when I was invited back in 2009, when I was invited back to Germany to visit at the expense of the Berlin government, I revisited some of the material that accompanied this letter from my father's cousin. And in addition to the pictures of his father and my grandfather lying next to each other in adjoining graves in the Berlin cemetery, in the Orthodox Jewish cemetery, was a roster of the graves and the identification, and it listed these two gentlemen who happened to be brothers-in-law at the time, saying that they were killed in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. And I only noticed this in 2009, that they were 15 years apart in age, and they died within 3 months of each other in the same place. And I went to my Google Maps, and I found the location of the cemetery. And I looked up I Googled this concentration camp and found out that they didn't have gas chambers there until 1942. And these two gentlemen, my grandfather and his brother-in-law, died in the year 1940. They died 2 years before there were gas chambers. And apparently anybody who died under circumstances after being arrested and sent to the camps, they called the relatives to come and bury Uncle Adolf or Uncle Leib or whoever it might be. And it became the responsibility of the Jewish community to take care of them. We subsequently visited the grave, which I understand my grandson and his wife and grandchildren visited the grave, and it's still there. And we were able to say Kaddish over the grave of my grandfather, which my father never had a chance to do. Coincidentally, one of the things that my father always regretted, that he never had a chance to say Kaddish, and he never had a chance to have a formal goodbye. And we stayed in a hotel in 2009 when we were visiting in Berlin that happened to be across the street from the Friedrichstrasse rail terminal. And my dad always talked about the last time he saw his father, who was seeing him off to the boat in Bremerhaven. They said goodbye in the Friedrichstrasse. Railroad station, and I was almost able to relive it. I was standing in the station. I was never there, but I made a connection there. It was almost as if I was there. I could visualize the scene. And it was one of my most cherished moments to be able to say Kaddish in my father's name.
How did Grandma and Grandpa meet?
Grandma lived in a small town in Germany called Brambau, where she was born, and she went to Berlin to visit with her Uncle Willie, who was my maternal grandfather's brother, and was also a furrier that had a prosperous business in Berlin. My father learned how to be a furrier from Uncle Willie, and when my mother came to Berlin to visit with her Uncle Willie, she met my father, who was working in Uncle Willie's shop. And beyond that, I don't know, but that's how they met each other.
That's great. Okay. And when did they get married?
They got married in January of 1937.
I think you said you knew the date.
31st, I believe.
January 31st, 1937. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we haven't covered that you want future generations of Weintraubs to know about our family's history? Actually, I'm gonna ask you. I have a question before that, and that's a big one to kind of leave there. So I'm gonna ask you. Tell me about, and this is a story that, as far as I know, is true. That when Grandpa left Germany, when he couldn't put his store, he had a store, and he couldn't just say I'm going out of business and get them, and sell all his inventory. He just had to kind of lock the door and leave as if he was leaving for the night.
Exactly.
So tell me more about that, as far as you know.
Well, I believe I told you that he was warned by somebody who was working, a friend of his who was working in the American Embassy, that the undocumented Jews of Polish extraction that were living in Germany at the time would shortly be kicked out of the country. This is before the war started. And it came to pass, and I'm jumping ahead, it came to pass that there were several thousand Polish Jews living in Germany were taken by train to the Polish border and literally kicked off the train. So this fellow in the American Embassy, as the story goes, warned my father there was time to get out. And how do you get out when your wife is pregnant? And they made the decision that this was the thing to do because my mother was born in Germany. They thought she would have less of a difficulty staying there for a while. And my father came to the United States, and my mother, a pregnant mother, was parked in her in-laws' apartment until she too was able to come to the United States.
Wasn't there a story about Grandpa having a relative here or an aunt in the States or something like that?
Yes, he had an aunt, a Tante Hilda, and I forget his name. And they always were, my father was always grateful to these people because my Aunt Hilda worked as a charwoman. She was a cleaning lady. Very, very, very poor people, even in my time that I remembered them. But they gave up what my father called the Kischgegeld, the stomach food money, to put up a $2,000 bond to promise the immigration authorities that my father would not become a ward of the state. So they had a visa that they a commitment to support my father while he was in the States, so he wouldn't be going on unemployment or to welfare rolls. Krupenny, that was their name. They lived on Catellieu Road in Brooklyn. Kischgegeld, food money.
So I'll ask that question again. Is there anything that we haven't covered about our family's history that you want future generations to know?
Well, I'm sure the 13 children that are in the next generation will recognize how well, at least from our perspective, the two families, the children of my first wife, Marilyn, and my current wife, Sandra, how they became as close to one family as you can get, given the impediments to blending families. And I think if we had anything to do with making that happen, we were really grateful that it did happen, that the children have grown up together, they know each other, they talk to each other, they spend holidays together, and we remark all the time how fortunate we are that there's been so little friction between those families. I'm talking about in the third generation. Thank you.